Burnt out. Bankrupt. Redundant.
Is this what it's all about for you now, Eddie? Sticking your tongue out at the Tories? It's pathetic.
Come on! Come on!
Nicky, you've had what you wanted.
Come on! Come on!
And I'm not talking about elections or parties. I'm talking about me.
I want me dad! I want me dad!
How is it, do you think, that I couldn't see him?
Because he knows you're useless, son.
Our Friends in the North continues next Monday at 9 on BBC Two.
Tense drama on BBC One shortly. Meredith Baxter-Burney plays an alcoholic forced to change her ways when her son is kidnapped. Christopher Reeve also stars in Bump in the Night. Wales can see that in 25 minutes. There's a slight change to our schedule tonight here on BBC Two. The travel show Essential Guide to Hungary and India will now be shown at a later date. And instead, now on BBC Two, a specially extended Newsnight.
In a few minutes' time, the Commons will deliver its verdict on the Scott report. After a highly charged debate, will tonight's vote save the government or send it spinning towards an election? Good evening. Tonight, Newsnight is on the air early to bring you live the result of tonight's crucial vote on the Scott report. Here at Westminster, the Commons divided at 10 o'clock. They're still voting, and any moment now we'll find out whether the government has garnered enough support to fight off the Labour attack. 11 long days after its official release, the report was filleted on the floor of the House. The President of the Board of Trade, Ian Lang, insisted the government stood acquitted of the central charges. The response flew across the floor from Labour's Robin Cook, who put in a performance worthy of a forensic scientist. This is not a government that knows how to take blame. It's a government that knows no shame. We'll be joined by frontbenchers from government and opposition, and we'll be hearing from Tories who threatened rebellion. Did they follow through? Also, what about the Ulster Unionists, whose votes are so crucial to the government?
And back here in the studio, we'll have first reaction from a former minister, a representative from the top civil servants union, one of the QCs who acted for the Matrix Churchill defendants, and 5 Tory activists from all the way across the country. We'll hear how the whole Scott debate and the government's conduct of the affair has gone down in the country from schools to factories. And also tonight, Thomas Creedon, the severely disabled toddler whose parents had asked permission to end his life by stopping his feeding, has died after an infection. Why is it that doctors are allowed to refuse antibiotics for the desperately ill, but may not make other life and death decisions?
Now, with that vote only a few moments away, we can go over to John Sopel, who's closeted in the Commons commentary box watching what's happened. John, first of all, it's rather a complicated vote tonight.
Yes, Kirsty, it's quite extraordinary, really, because here we've had a 6.5-hour debate that goes to the heart of how our parliamentary democracy works. It comes at the end of a 3-year inquiry, an 1,800-page document, and all that MPs are voting on as we speak is whether this House do now adjourn. In other words, whether MPs pack up for the night and go home, or whether they stay and do a bit more work. And essentially, you'll know who's won by if they vote to pack up to go home, if they vote that the House do now adjourn, then that's a victory for the Labour Party with all the implications that flow from that, a confidence vote tomorrow or Wednesday. If they vote to stay a bit and do a bit more work, then the government have won.
So what about the notion that they've done enough to buy off the rebels? Do you believe that?
Well, we are in a brilliant vantage point here. I've seen that Rupert Allison, one of the rebels, has voted with the government. Having said that, we've seen that Quentin Davis, who tried to get in at the end of the debate, has voted against the government. And we also know that some of the Ulster Unionists, who it was thought would probably abstain, I've seen some of them voting with the opposition. So this really is extremely close. The calculations that I was doing beforehand, based on the fact that the Unionists would abstain, would have probably given the government a majority of 7 or 9. I've seen at least 3 of them voting with the opposition. So it is extremely close indeed, and we should get that result in a couple of minutes' time.
So you're saying that it's clear now that some of the Ulster Unionists have voted with the opposition, not just the independent Ulster Unionists. So the idea they were trooping in to see John Major tonight hasn't had the desired effect.
Well, Kirsty, the three Ulster Unionists that I saw voting with the Labour Party and the opposition parties were Jim Molyneux, the former leader of the Ulster Unionists, Martin Smith, who is, of course, the Chief Whip, who was in there meeting John Major. Now, as I speak, I see some of the whips are going forward to the clerk of the House. I don't know whether you can make it out just in the sort of top three-quarters right hand of the picture. They're going up to give their first indications, and the results are being given to the Chief Whips, the various whips. I think they're ready to vote.
You want to come to me?
I'm moving right back as far as possible, away from the tellers. These members here must find a seat before anything is declared. Move right away from the tellers.
The House is immensely crowded. Now, let me just tell you a very quick guide for working out who has won in this. If the Conservative Whip speaks first, then the Conservatives have won. If the Labour Whip speaks first, the Labour Party have won. It looks like the Conservatives have got it. Let's hear the result.
Order, the honourable member will resume his seat. Thank you. Order.
The ayes to the right, 390. The noes to the left, 320.
Yeah!
Won by one single victory by one.
The noes to the left, 320. The noes have it. Order. By leave of the House,
Amazing noise inside there, and you can see just how close it was. The government won by 1 point. The government 320, the opposition 390. John Sopel, what do you make of that?
The motion on the order paper. Motion 3, whip to move. Question Montgomery. Where is he? To
deliver some analysis of that incredibly close vote.
Well, I mean, they have got away with it, and they've got away with it by just one. So it couldn't have been any closer. There is real relief on the faces of the Conservative MPs. Some of them were waving their order papers. Betty Boothroyd is trying to get on to other business now. No one is interested in the other business. The Conservatives have just scraped home by the closest of margins. There is relief on the government bench, huge relief. But I suspect that in the Commons we haven't heard the end of Scott, although we have had the big debate tonight. I am sure the opposition parties still believe there is ammunition to be fired at the government on this issue, although the government have won, admittedly, by the narrowest of margins.
John Sopel, thank you. And now we can go back now to Peter Snow for some analysis.
Well, with me to discuss this extraordinarily close shave of the government, Francis Maude, former Tory minister, Geoffrey Robertson, QC, who acted for the Matrix Churchill Defendants, and Liz Simons, who was General Secretary of the Senior Civil Servants Union of the 1st Division Association. Geoffrey Robertson, one vote. Does that kill it off? Is that the end of it?
Not at all. It's just the beginning, I think. Parliament was on trial tonight. It was acquitted by one vote. Parliament was misled.
One vote's enough, isn't it?
Well, I don't think so. I think this is just the beginning. After all, it was Parliament that was misled. The question tonight is whether Parliament was capable of doing anything about it, either by requiring resignations of those ministers who were personally at fault, or by legislating a Freedom of Information Act. Neither of those happened. The government squeaked through, and I think that's the beginning of ordinary people asking, what can Parliament do when it's misled? What happens now about ministerial accountability? I think it will lead to great cynicism in the country and perhaps a great desire for constitutional reform and change.
Liz Simons, do you see any prospect of ministers resigning now after this?
No, not at all. I think the problem will be now, certainly as far as civil servants are concerned, whether there will be any disciplinary action taken against civil servants, whether civil servants are left to carry the can that ministers have so obviously failed to do.
Now, Francis Maude, one vote, scraping through by one vote on this massive issue of government responsibility and accountability, that's not good enough, is it?
Well, this is a government which has an overall majority of 2 now, so on an issue where there were going to be some Tory dissensions, I think one vote is not particularly unexpected. So I don't think there's any great significance in that. I mean, I think the most astonishing thing about this is our instinct, somehow, whenever anything like this comes up, for magnifying it out of all proportion. I think if you were in any continental country which has seen real scandals with corruption or with real deceit by politicians of their parliaments. And they would be astonished that we're making such a meal of this. After all, this is one country in Europe which actually had a principled stand against selling arms to Iraq, and where, from where there were no lethal weapons found in Iraq after the Gulf War. This all came about because the government decided, uniquely I think in Europe, to take this disciplined and moral stance about arms to
Yes, we made
Iraq.
Saddam's bombs and missiles. Of course we made the bombs for Saddam.
Well, the fact is, we had, since 1984, I think, guidelines which said no lethal weapons.
Which we changed secretly
well,
and didn't tell Parliament.
Well, that's a matter
that's what Scott finds.
That's a matter that's actually a matter of opinion.
Scott actually
and
uses the word
and lots of
parliamentary democracy was
yes, but has this vote now resolved that or not? Has this vote resolved this debate? Will it fade away in the public eye or not?
It can't have done that, because actually, of course, the Scott report said two quite different and actually rather contradictory things. The Scott report said not only that Parliament was misled, but the Parliament was misled deliberately, and that was a crucial distinction that he made. He then went on to say that ministers had no intention of misleading Parliament. Now, how you can have, on the one hand, deliberate misleading and non-intentional misleading is...
The fact is, he accepted that ministers genuinely believed that what they were doing was exercising flexibility, which had been available to be used throughout in the way the guidelines were operated. They genuinely believed that there were no changes in the substance of the guidelines, and so they genuinely believed that what they were telling Parliament was true.
But they genuinely gave misleading answers.
Sir Richard Scott, as a matter of his opinion, concludes, and, you know, fair enough for him, that they were wrong. And now that's up to him to say.
He concluded they were wrong,
that doesn't mean that they were
don't.
culpable. That doesn't mean that they were guilty of deception, the sort of deception, any deception, which would mean that they ought to resign. I think that's a fair enough
misled
conclusion.
Parliament. That's Scott's clear finding, and you can't get out of that.
Yes, but if you,
the question is, how often is Parliament going to be misled? The reason Scott found that they misled Parliament was that they were afraid of public criticism.
But this
how many other issues are ministers afraid of public criticism about?
I could quite easily, when I was a minister, have misled Parliament inadvertently, because something I said turned out not to be the case.
As Scott found here.
It was the same misrepresentation, so it isn't 27 different ones, that's simply 27 letters.
It was over 5 years, 27 occasions over 5 years, which is on one subject.
No great
how many other
significance on
subjects?
that.
Health,
But the fact is,
It doesn't resolve the issue of saying that Parliament was deliberately misled, designedly misled, and the problem that the civil service will now have is how you frame answers to parliamentary questions when we have got this sort of judgment hanging in the air with nothing properly resolved.
Right.
This vote has not resolved that, hasn't resolved ministerial accountability.
We'll leave it there for the moment. We'll be back. Back to you, Kirsty, at Westminster.
Thank you, Peter. And let's just recap on that vote now. We can see just how close a call it was, with the government winning by just one vote. There we have it, the government 320 and the opposition 319. And we'll be hearing from frontbenchers, both from the government and opposition, in just a few moments' time. Well, soon after the debate began, it appeared that yet again the government and the opposition have been reading two different reports. The government front bench sat stony-faced, the opposition barracked as Ian Lang put his head down and charged on with his defence. He did admit that mistakes had been made and lessons would have to be learned, but he went on to duff up Robin Cook, accusing him of being odious and vindictive and misleading the country. In a few minutes, the debate will continue here in the studio, but first, let's speak now to Mark Mardell in the Commons.
So the government has only just pulled it off. Last-minute meetings with cabinet ministers have soothed fevered brows of potential malcontents. After 10 days of swearing that Scott washed whiter than white, today was the government's day to be slightly conciliatory.
That is documented in Erskine May.
In the last half an hour, the Cabinet Minister Roger Freeman has been on his feet, giving very detailed answers aimed at mollifying the concerns of particular troublesome backbenchers. For one case he seemed to regard as beyond hope.
I ask my honourable friend to accept that evidence. I ask my honourable friend to accept the argument that I have advanced, that junior ministers interpreted those guidelines in the different circumstances of the end of the conflict.
Sir Nicholas, if the government loses tonight, will you resign?
No. It was never going to be an easy day for the ministers under pressure, made worse for Sir Nicholas Lyle when a traffic warden did not decide that his car was not parked illegally. Scott's justice was not so instant, and whatever ministers say, a lot hung on tonight's vote.
Madam Speaker,
The president of the Board of Trade was trying out a more reflective, if not quite penitent, line on a packed House of Commons. He said there wasn't a good case for a Freedom of Information Act, but action would be taken.
Mistakes were made. There are lessons to be learned. The government has accepted the inquiry's criticisms concerning the distribution of intelligence material and has already taken action to improve it.
As Mr Lang ploughed through his detailed speech, the opposition grew increasingly noisy and unruly. Frustrated members interrupted him with points of order until Mr Lang returned to the old party ding-dong, having a go at Robin Cook.
For 3 years, the honourable gentleman went around this country accusing this government of secretly arming Saddam Hussein and of attempting to gag the courts. Those two very serious charges are completely rejected by the report, and he now tries vindictively and contemptibly to shift his ground in order to continue this odious smear campaign.
The Conservatives' dislike of Mr Cook is laced with a healthy dose of fear. He maintained all of his allegations had been proved. The government had yet to make a case.
This is a government which is fond of lecturing the rest of the nation on its need to accept responsibility. Parents are held responsible for actions. Teachers are held responsible for the performance of their pupils. Local councillors are held legally and financially responsible. Yet when it comes to themselves, suddenly, not a single minister can be found to accept responsibility for what went wrong.
The rowdy House occasionally fell silent to better hear Mr Cook's precise charges as he widened his net from William Walgrave to attack Ian Lang and then the Prime Minister. Ministers collectively looked as though they'd swallowed tin tacks.
It is a serious charge. Will he now accept that far from being scurrilous, it was entirely accurate? Suddenly we have a row of limpets stuck to the Treasury bench.
This sort of knockabout stuff tends to reinforce entrenched party positions rather than change minds, but the government attempted to sweeten the mood of their backbenchers by handing out a number of concessions covering the Scott Report's main areas. On intelligence, the government will now discuss a procedural recommendation concerning personnel, but it hasn't been made public for security reasons. Customs prosecutions may come under tighter supervision by the Attorney-General. The government is urgently developing proposals. Export controls on arms will be reviewed, and the government is committed to take restraining action where this is necessary for wider policy reasons. There may be more disclosure of information. The current convention that ministers don't answer questions on arms sales should be reviewed, and current guidelines have been published today. On ministerial responsibility, the government will consider positively Sir Richard's suggestions, and on public interest immunity certificates, the government will consider whether the time is opportune for a collective reappraisal by ministers. Some found this hard to swallow. While most Tories defended the government line, a few sounded distinctly sour.
And I want to know, is anyone accountable for this? Is anyone responsible? Is no civil servant to be addressed? What is going to happen to Sir Robin Butler? What is going to happen to our distinguished ambassador in Saudi Arabia who believes that half the picture is more than good enough for this House? Remember, the principle is this House shall have the information.
Let us also not talk about whether it's reasonable to make changes in arms control policy, arms sales policy. Of course it is. No one's denying that. No problem at all. It's very different to make changes and then to pretend to this House you haven't made them. That's the point.
But the Tory establishment has closed ranks. As the Commons argued, the more stately lords were hearing something rather unusual. Lady Thatcher coming to the defence of the government.
I'm sure there was never any intent to mislead on the part of Mr. Waldegrave or any other ministers, and Sir Richard Scott himself concludes that there was not duplicitous intent.
A key player today has been the Ulster Unionist leader David Trimble. He met the Prime Minister tonight. His party can save the government when Tories rebel. This debate takes place in the shadow of intense negotiations about the future of Northern Ireland. Unionists need government reassurance that elections there won't be held under an electoral system that benefits their opponents.
What has soured relations in the past few days is the question of a so-called list system for elections in Northern Ireland. Mr Major is still solid on the idea of the elections which the Unionists want, but the particular form of election he's going for is very much something that suits Dr Paisley's party and possibly also suits the SDLP.
The sick were again brought into vote by both sides. The last time that happened, the government lost. Tonight they won, although the opposition hope the story is far from over.
Mark Mardell, we're joined now from outside the Commons by David Trimble, the leader of the Ulster Unionists. How did you vote tonight?
Well, the 9 Ulster Unionist members of Parliament voted with the opposition in the debate on the Scott report.
Why did you do that?
We did that on the merits of the issues, which I think are fairly clear. It is extremely important to us as backbenchers, and we're never going to be anything other than backbenchers the way things are, that the integrity of the parliamentary process is maintained. And to have a situation where, as Scott said, time and time again, Parliament was misled and deliberately and designedly misled is not an acceptable situation. I think it's very important that we send the message to the government that that is not something about which we have no opinion.
But if you were dealing with this solely on the merits of the issue, what was the value or otherwise of your meeting with John Major earlier?
Any meetings I had with ministers today were at their request, not at mine.
In these meetings, were the discussions restricted to the Scott report, or were you talking about the peace process?
Sorry, somebody else speaking there. I mean, the discussions we had with ministers were actually quite brief and dealt with this and a number of other issues. But there was no question of deals being made of that nature. I've seen speculation that deals were made with other parties which weren't present to vote, but we weren't in the business of making deals. We decided tonight on the merits of the issue.
But although your meeting with John Major was at his behest and not yours, did you not get what you were looking for by way of a deal from him?
I said we weren't in the business of making deals. We made our decision tonight on the merits of the issue. The Scott report is an extremely important issue, both in terms of parliamentary accountability and also an issue which I have taken a very keen personal interest in with regard to public interest immunities and the conduct of the Attorney General. And as you know, I personally have been on record on that issue quite some time ago.
Now, the Ulster Unionists have made it clear that they'll deal with parliamentary business vote by vote.
That's right.
But is tonight's collective vote a signal to John Major over the next few months that your support can certainly not be taken for granted?
No. I mean, as you say, we decide vote by vote, and we did consider tonight what might happen if the government lost in this vote and there was consummately a vote of confidence. And if there was a vote of confidence, we would then be deciding on quite different criteria and probably arrive at, or might very easily arrive at, a different decision. But that was another matter. That wasn't tonight's decision.
But there are crucial votes coming up. So can you give us some indication of what you're actually looking for from this government? Let's talk just very briefly now what you're looking for this government with the summit coming up tomorrow.
Well, sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
With the summit coming up tomorrow, what is it you are actually looking for from this government?
Oh, right, you're referring to the summit. I didn't know it was tomorrow. I thought it was on Wednesday, so that quite threw me for a moment. I mean, obviously, we want to see, in terms of what's called the peace process, that the government take full account of the resumption of violence by Sinn Féin IRA and insist that there be a genuine cessation of violence, not just a ceasefire again, because we now know how little such a ceasefire is worth. We want to see a genuine cessation of violence, which is going to be hold out the promise of it being permanent and that people are committed to entirely peaceful means. Now, whether there's any likelihood of the leadership of Sinn Féin IRA even thinking in those terms, I don't know. I'd be very interested to know what the two gentlemen who were speaking to civil servants in the Northern Ireland office today, being the present Chief of Staff of the IRA and the former Chief of Staff of the IRA, what they had to say, what message they conveyed. I don't know what that message was, but I think that's something that anyone concerned for the future would want to know the answers to.
David Trimble, thank you very much for joining us. And now we can look at that result just one more time just now to catch up if you haven't already seen it. The government scraped by one vote. That was 320 to 319. Well, I'm joined now here in the studio at Westminster by Ian Lang, by Donald Dewar, and also by Mingus Campbell. First of all, Ian Lang, you won by one vote. Is that it then, the end of the matter?
No, it isn't, because today in my speech I laid out a large number of initiatives which we are going to embark upon.
I think that once you set aside the big headline-grabbing issues of the Scott report, the question of whether we were sending arms secretly to Saddam Hussein and whether we were conspiring to put men in prison, which we weren't in both cases, and Scott vindicates us on that, then we open up quite a lot of issues where there is need for improvement and where we are going to do things, and I listed them today in my speech.
But you yourself said these are the big issues. Let's just deal with this business about government secrecy over sales of equipment to Iraq. I understand that Lord Howe said the scope for misunderstanding is enormous and the fear of public opposition. Isn't that the most patronising attitude, and indeed the opposite, the antithesis of accountable government, that you don't allow the public to make up its own mind?
No, those are factors, but those are not major factors. Some of the major factors are the confidentiality of the countries who purchase arms for defence from us. There are also diplomatic and strategic considerations. For example, around 1989 and 90, there was a new administration taking over in the United States. There was anxiety over that. There was a threat to British shipping in the Gulf. There was the problem of the hostages being held in the Lebanon, Terry Waite and John McCarthy, Brian Keenan and Jackie Mann, and so on. There were lots of other issues that affected it. But the important issue now is that on accountability to Parliament and answering questions, defence questions, we consider whether there is a way in which we can be more forthcoming, abandoning the convention that is not this is not between parties, this is a cross-party issue, abandoning the convention that successive governments has followed, and finding ways where we can disclose more information on intelligence and on defence to Parliament without jeopardising British interests.
Donald Dewar, with the vote going against you tonight by one, is that it? You'll not get your resignations now?
We should, but we probably won't, at least for a while. Though it's interesting to see at least one Conservative MP saying, don't sack Lyle yet. And I don't think this is finished. We've had a tremendous result today. We won the debate hands down, a brilliant performance from Robin Cook. And the Tories were saved by the rather odd combination of one MP who has been abusing them and criticising them throughout the debate on Scott, and Mr Ian Paisley and his DUP party. There was a 100% attendance of Liberal MPs, 100% attendance of Labour MPs, and I think that our troops will be going home feeling that the government's on the defensive and they've had a thoroughly shaming day.
Now, when you look at Ian Lang's speech today, he didn't actually deal with the criticisms line by line. In fact, we haven't had that yet. Mingus Campbell, where's the key criticism that you would like to put to Ian Lang now that wasn't answered?
Well, I put it to him last week and I put it to him today, which is Sir Richard Scott has found the government, having announced a policy, then changed that policy, but prevented Parliament and the public from finding out about that change. And it did so for the reasons not of national interest or anything like that. It did so because it thought there'd be public embarrassment, because there'd be public opposition to the notion, for example, of continuing to send machine tools to Saddam Hussein and to extend export credit guarantees to him a matter of weeks after he used chemical weapons on his own countrymen at Halabja. The government concealed all of that, not out of the national interest, but in order to avoid its own embarrassment.
Do you deny that there was concealment?
I deny exactly what Min Campbell has
But
said.
do you not deny there was concealment?
Some things are always withheld in foreign affairs and in defence matters, and that is understood, and it is recognised by Sir Richard Scott. The question is where you draw the line. Now, we have drawn the line, as previous governments have done, on sensitive answering of defence questions. We've actually moved further. We published the guidelines that we operated in the Iran-Iraq war.
That's exactly the point.
And we have published a lot of other things with our white paper on openness, our questions of procedure for ministers, and a range of other things.
The real issue is that in the past, it is true, governments have said they will not give information. This government gave misleading and wrong information.
No.
That's where the dishonesty. What was described as deliberate concealment.
No.
There was a failure to allow evidence to go to select committees. There was a failure to reveal. These are all phrases used again and again, and that's the distinction. It's no good saying in the past things weren't let out.
Deliberate misleading of Parliament, and I heard opposition members repeatedly saying...
You've read the report, Ian.
Sir Richard Scott says that Parliament was misled on some things on which he has reached conclusions, but he also accepts that ministers gave information or withheld information in good faith, believing that what they were doing was accurate. And having read...
You can still act in good faith and withhold information. You can still act in good faith and have an entirely mistaken view of your responsibility to Parliament, of the doctrine of ministerial responsibility, of ministerial accountability. That is the charge against William Walgrave. Not that he's a crook, but that he's been incompetent.
What Sir Richard Scott was conceding implicitly and acknowledging that all ministers acted in good faith and sincerely believed that what they were doing and saying was correct, was that there was an alternative conclusion to his own, which in all honour and in good faith could just as easily be held as his own. Now, I believe that his conclusion is actually wrong. And I've looked not just at his report, but all the back papers as well. And if I hadn't believed that ministers had acted in good faith and had not deliberately misled Parliament, I would not have been willing to stand at the dispatch box and defend them.
Well, you came to the dispatch box, but the very nature of the debate was one that was quite peculiar to have an adjournment debate. It didn't allow for any amendments from the opposition. It wasn't, as it were, a full and frank debate in front of the public at which different points could be put by way of amendments.
With respect, it was actually, and there were an awful lot of issues to raise. And I covered, for example, how we're going to proceed on export controls, how we're going to proceed on public interest immunity, how we're going to proceed on questions of procedure, on answering parliamentary questions, on greater openness and accountability within Parliament. Some of these are important philosophical issues that affect the very heart of the way in which Parliament operates, and others are specific administrative ones on which we have to make progress.
I mean, let's leave the philosophy aside at the moment. We'll certainly return to that. Let's take one key finding in fact from the Scott report, and that is that William Waldegrave and 2 other government ministers considered the fact that there was a change in the guidelines on the sale of arms and decided deliberately that they wouldn't reveal that fact because they feared strong public opposition.
No.
Now that's a finding in fact.
No, it isn't. It's a wrong fact. William Waldegrave and Alan Clark reached agreement, and they said that if David Trefgarne, the 3rd Minister from the 3rd Department, agreed with them, they would then put the matter to their Secretaries of State, and then to the Prime Minister, and then publish it.
What
that is all minuted and recorded.
But what happened in the interim? They began to operate the new guidelines.
Lord Trefgarne did not agree, and therefore the new guideline which they had considered, which incidentally did no more than reflect the fact that there was now peace where before there had been war,
let me put a specific point in mind.
Because the fatwa, that was a different issue altogether, and that was decided on commercial grounds. Iran wasn't even asking for commercial credit guarantees. And you don't measure that. You don't measure that by saying if you give 100 million of guarantees to Iraq, you must give 100 million to Iran. What you do is you say if you are giving Iraq guarantees, then you must be willing to consider on commercial grounds similar guarantees.
I would like to know if Ian Lang...
There's one point I just want to put, moving this on a little bit, I just want to ask you one straightforward thing about the prosecution. Do you believe that the Matrix Churchill trial, now when you've read everything in the report, when you know what you know, do you believe these men should ever have been prosecuted in the first place?
Well, I am inclined to agree with Sir Richard Scott, who said in hindsight, a case that collapses within the first few weeks before the prosecution has finished its case should never have been brought. That is with hindsight, as he himself acknowledges. What was acknowledged at the time was that the public interest immunity certificates were properly made, the judge said so, that he saw all the documents, that Michael Heseltine's special PII certificate was drawn to his attention, and that the trial proceeded with some of the PII documents being disclosed and some not, and 3 of the 4 defence counsel have all conceded that that is the correct way and supported the Attorney General's decision on that matter.
Well, let's go back to Michael Heseltine. I actually heard Michael Heseltine giving evidence to Lord Justice Scott, and I went and I looked up the shorthand transcript of the notes of evidence, and indeed I used it in my speech. He asked the Attorney General to make sure that his views were properly conveyed to the prosecuting counsel in the case. They were not conveyed in the way that he understood they were to be conveyed.
They were conveyed in the terms of his special certificate and acknowledged by the judge.
He expressed concern about that. He expressed concern, if I may say so, in pretty robust terms and evidence. And what's very curious, how that concern has evaporated under the influence of an adjournment motion
We'll have to come back to
this
in a moment, because right now we have Quintin Davis outside the House of Commons. Quintin Davis.
Unionists and the Liberals and...
Quintin Davis, hello.
Right.
Yes, hello. I believe you can hear me now. I understand that Roger Freeman gave you a very hard time at the end of the vote for your behaviour in voting against the government. Was there nothing the government could offer you by way of some kind of ameliorating... Mr. Davis, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, yes.
Mr. Davis, I understand that you got a very hard time from Mr. Freeman at the end of the debate. Was there nothing the government could offer you that changed your mind?
Well, no, I made my point quite clear, and I intervened on Roger Freeman, as you saw, that was an intervention that he couldn't really accept, I think. It went to the heart of the debate. He went to the heart of the issue of whether or not ministers had been frank with the House of Commons, or whether or not they had misled the House of Commons. I accept the judgment of Lord Justice Scott on that. The government doesn't do so. But Parliament is now pronounced. Parliament has decided in favour of the government, and I was on the losing side, albeit by 1 vote. I've always accepted the judgment of Parliament, the decisions of Parliament, and so far as I'm concerned, that is therefore the end of the matter.
So is the end of the matter not the beginning of a campaign by you, perhaps, for more open government?
Oh, well, that's a different matter. It's the end of the issue as to whether or not William Waldegrave ought to publicly acknowledge responsibility for misleading the House, or how he ought to do that. That's been an issue over the last few days. It was an issue that was resolved by the vote tonight. The whole issue of open government is, of course, extremely important. I've always been a supporter of a Freedom of Information Act. That's not a new thing. I didn't come up with that this week. I felt that for some time, and when I was on the Treasury and Civil Service Select Committee, it's now separated, there are two committees, but there is now a separate Civil Service Committee. When I was on the combined committee, I made that quite clear. I feel the American experience in open government has actually been a great success, and I think we should move forward there. We have already, of course, made considerable strides forward in this Parliament, and I think that's very important. One of the great things about modern democracy is the electronic media do enable people to follow the processes of government, the arguments that are going on, the decision-making procedures much more closely than was ever the case in previous ages. And I think that's a very positive thing for democracy, and I'm very keen to do everything possible to encourage our institutions to move in that direction.
Quentin Davis, thank you. And beside you is Rupert Allison, who was another potential rebel, but in fact one who supported the government in the end. What did the government do that changed your mind?
They killed public interest immunity certificates once and for all in the way that they were deployed against the defendants in the Matrix Churchill case.
And that was your only quibble with the whole of the way the Scott report was being handled?
Well, it's not a quibble. I mean, I spent 3 years trying to stop public interest immunity certificates being abused, and trying to stop national security, so-called, being deployed to prevent defendants from getting a fair trial. And the advantage of being a backbencher in this situation is that you extract maximum advantage from this particular strategy.
So you think, in fact, that a lot of your lobbying on PIIs actually made a difference?
Well, that's what it appeared in the Commons this evening. I made my speech. I covered a lot of ground on public interest immunity certificates. I then intervened on Roger Freeman in order to get 2 absolutely firm undertakings. From now onwards, the emphasis will be on the disclosure of documents, not the suppression of documents. And even where documents are very sensitive, they will be disclosed, but some of them will be redacted, which means the sensitive parts blacked out. I mean, that's an enormous step forward.
Rupert Allison, thank you very much indeed. Well, in all this, the spotlight falls on John Major and the style of his leadership. One of the prime ministerial hallmarks was billed as open government, but the history of his pursuit of such a policy has hardly been pain-free. The Nolan report, the Greenbury report, and now with Scott, the triple whammy. None of them went entirely the prime minister's way. Here's Gordon Brewer.
He said, John Major kept his silence today when challenged to respond to criticisms in the Scott report. It was a silence which attracted the derision of Labour's Robin Cook.
Suddenly we have a row of limpets stuck to the Treasury bench.
At stake in this whole affair, not just the Scott report itself, but John Major's standing as a champion of open government. When the Prime Minister won the election, few thought he could win. It was as a man of the people. Trailing his soapbox through the towns of Middle England, he had a simple message for the electorate. He was not a creature of Whitehall, but their ally in stripping away what he called a cobweb of secrecy from government. The theme was taken up in the Queen's speech immediately after the election.
My government will give priority to improving public services through the Citizens' Charter, which will be at the centre of decision-making. Steps will be taken to apply Charter principles throughout the public service.
One of the reasons I think the government picked it up as a sub-theme was because it was an idea whose time had come, but also John Major wanted to be seen as open, honest John, the person who was candid with the public, the person who didn't deceive the public. And in that sense, as a generalized part of the government's image, I think the idea of openness was important.
It was William Waldegrave, one of the 2 ministers at the centre of the Scott inquiry, who was charged with carrying out this new policy of openness.
Information has to be usable and accessible. Just to have a right of access to things which may be immensely complex and not usable by the citizen doesn't really take you very much further forward.
Liz Simons, who runs the trade union for top civil servants, says the reality is little has changed.
The worry is that although you can get hold of more factual information than you could do 4 years ago, the ordinary person in this country, indeed many politicians, is no closer to understanding how government works, how the machine of government actually operates, where the beginning and the end of authority, responsibility and accountability really lie.
In the government's response to the Scott report, there are eerie echoes of the criticisms of ministers made in the report itself. Scott accuses ministers of being highly selective with the facts. No sooner was his report published than civil servants were bombarding journalists with press releases containing highly selective quotations from the report justifying the government's position. Scott complains that ministers breached guidelines on their accountability to Parliament. For the past 10 days, those same ministers have been insisting that whoever is responsible for the state of affairs so damningly criticised by Scott, it certainly isn't them. The initial reaction to Scott was almost brazenly unapologetic. Ian Lang led the government's defence on February the 15th.
In respect of my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, who was at the time one of the junior ministers concerned, Sir Richard goes on to say that, and I quote again, he did not intend his letters to be misleading and did not so regard them. My right honourable friend is therefore absolved of the charge that he intended to mislead members of this House or anyone else.
But that didn't wash. Some Tory MPs rebelled, claiming the matters raised by Scott went beyond party allegiance.
I can understand why it's very tempting not to want to confront reality, not to want to confront the hard truth that Parliament was misled. But we have to face that, we have to grapple with that, or else we'll do permanent damage to our Constitution.
Mr. Secretary Lang. So by today, it was a rather different Ian Lang who addressed the House of Commons. The commitment to open government had returned.
There is a continuing line of criticism running through the report of the conventions long established in this House, whereby successive governments have undervalued, as Sir Richard Scott sees it, the public interest in the disclosure of information. This government has a good record in improving openness in government, and the debate on how much further openness in Parliament might go should be seen in that context. For example,
it was a gamble that worked, getting the government through in the short term at least. But where does it leave the project of open government? Civil servants say the situation is now worse than ever. It's unclear who's supposed to be responsible for government departments. It's unclear who's to blame if Parliament is misled. And they claim, in its reaction to Scott, the government has undermined the independence of the machinery of state.
Many of the people who I represent have felt that the government machine has been geared to a political end rather than to the end of establishing a better machine of government. Now, Sir Richard Scott says there ought to be more openness in government. That's something that the overwhelming majority of civil servants would agree with. The problem is Sir Richard doesn't say how you put that into practice. The real answer is that we can't keep on putting sticking plaster over what are quite obviously enormous difficulties that have emerged.
The long and short of it is, from the government's point of view, is that it's got this reputation for being not wholly competent, for not being entirely honourable in its dealings. And the vote tonight is not going to make any difference to that at all. It will certainly not cause any voter out there to want to draw a line under this episode.
With tonight's vote, John Major lives to fight another day. But honest John and his open government, that's a show which may now be much more difficult to get back on the road.
Gordon Brewer. Now we can go back to Westminster and John Sopel for news of a row that has broken out between the Ulster Unionists and Sir Patrick Mayhew. John, what are the details?
Well, I've spoken to a senior Northern Ireland ministerial source who told me that far from this being an amicable meeting between the Ulster Unionists and the Prime Minister and Northern Ireland Minister, it was rather heated. The Ulster Unionists, according to this ministerial source, wanted a deal. They wanted a specific commitment to the electoral mechanism that would be used to some future Northern Irish body, and that the terms, and they went in with very specific demands on how this should come about, how the body should be constituted. And I'm told that the ministers that were there and the Prime Minister had absolutely no option but to say no in no uncertain terms. and I gather that there was quite an angry meeting, and this is why we had the surprise in the vote about half an hour ago when some of the Ulster Unionists voted with the opposition against expectation. According to a Northern Ireland ministerial source, the Ulster Unionists went in demanding a deal. They didn't get it. Now, what implications that has for the Northern Ireland peace process remain to be seen. But I suspect it probably strengthens John Major's hand in that he wasn't prepared to do anything to secure victory tonight, because we saw how close he came to losing.
John Sopel, thank you very much. And now we can go back to Peter.
Well, there may have been heated debate in the Commons over the detail of the Scott report, but how many people away from Westminster are taking much notice of it all? And how far do the issues of integrity and accountability strike a chord with people at home? Fiona Bruce went to Bristol, where William Waldegrave has his constituency, and discovered that there are people who are deeply concerned.
4 years ago, an employee of this sheet metal works in Bristol had his fingers crushed when another employee removed a safety guard from a steel guillotine. The factory owner, Robert Davis, was fined by the Health and Safety Executive. Although the accident wasn't directly his fault, he believes that the HSE were right to call him to account.
Ultimately, I'm responsible for what goes on in this company. Obviously, I give authority to other people to carry out their duties, but I have to supervise the way in which this is done. So yes, ultimately, I have no option but to accept responsibility. It may on some occasions appear a little unfair and a little onerous, but that is the way the world looks at the matter, I think.
Despite the government's conciliatory tone in today's Commons debate, Robert Davis believes ministers are reluctant to take responsibility in the way that he had to for his own company.
I do believe the government is less liable to take the rap for things that go wrong, and I think this is a very unfortunate factor in modern political life. I believe very much in the principle of accountability of ministers and of other participants in the political process.
The workers at this factory have formed a clear impression that the government isn't telling the whole story.
Trying to wriggle out. I think ordinary man on the street, they wouldn't understand the Scott report anyway. You know, they rely on what they hear about in the news and the papers. But the overall view you get from it always is just a major cover-up.
I've always voted Tory, but the Scott report I think is the last straw. I think next time round I will vote, go down through the middle and not vote Tory again.
The government's reaction to the criticisms raised in the Scott report have put the issues of honour and accountability under the spotlight. We've come to Bristol, to William Waldegrave's constituency, to gauge public reaction to the government's position and to ask, is the response of ministers merely symptomatic of society's attitude towards accountability? Does anyone volunteer to take the rap these days out of a sense of honour? 10 years ago, rioting broke out in the St Paul's area of Bristol following a police raid on local drug dealers. There was an outcry from Labour councillors over allegations of police heavy-handedness. The chair of the local police authority, Tom Turvey, chose to resign rather than stand at odds with his political colleagues.
I felt I had to resign. I hadn't done anything wrong. I believe that I had been right throughout, but it seemed to me to continue to stand out against the desires of my party would have created a rift and difficulty within the Labour Party, which I was not prepared to do.
So you resigned as a matter of principle?
I did indeed, on a matter of principle.
Following the developments at Westminster today regarding the Scott report, Tom Turvey believes political principle has been sacrificed to political expediency.
I was listening to the debate. I'm still of the opinion that it's been very badly handled. They found excuses rather than reasons for what had happened. And to be quite honest, whatever is said now, the damage had been done at the time when the ministers failed to report to the House. So that whatever arguments are put forward now doesn't really make any difference at all.
It's at school, above all, where tomorrow's politicians and voters are supposed to learn a code of ethics, develop a sense of integrity and personal responsibility. We came to Clifton College to see how the debate today at Westminster over the Scott report has gone down here.
Detail unload.
A public school established back in 1862, Clifton College prides itself on its tradition of turning out mature and well-rounded adults. Pupils take part in all manner of extracurricular activities designed to promote responsible citizenship.
right now there are 150 of them involved in charitable work round and about, and that's not meant to be compromising other things, but they're involved in writing for the disabled and so on. And I think that they've got to learn to be adults. After all, I've got 120 people here who will be able to vote by the time they leave school, and they've got to learn what holding a position of authority involves, not just the rewards, but the duty as well.
Sixth formers watched today's House of Commons debate as part of a series of class discussions about the Scott Report. Despite what they're taught at school about accountability, the pupils don't appear to expect the same high standards from their political leaders, including their constituency MP, William Waldegrave.
The Chief Secretary to the Treasury deliberately...
This is the real world, and you know, you don't have good decisions and bad decisions. It doesn't work like that. You have sort of lots of shades of grey.
You have decisions that work and decisions that don't, and you notice that people who are especially idealistic never, you often find that idealism is one of the first things that go, the first thing that goes when people come into high office.
When a decision doesn't work, though, doesn't someone have to take responsibility for that? I don't think the issue here now is whether the ministers were honest or whether they had integrity, but whether, taking into account the fact that things clearly did go wrong, shouldn't someone then take responsibility for that, be accountable?
Yeah, it's hard to place the blame on any one person when there's obviously clearly been many people involved, and the rather lengthy Scott report itself didn't come to any specific conclusion, so it's hard for us to comment on whether any of them should resign or not.
Let's hand down this through a bit, that's brilliant.
The government hoped that today's debate in the House of Commons might steer them into calmer political waters. But tonight it looks as if the row over the Scott report will continue to place the issue of ministerial accountability at the top of the political agenda.
Well, that was Fiona Bruce in Bristol. I'm joined now by 5 Tory activists from all over the country. Let's start with you, Sheila Foster. Now, you were in two minds about what you thought about the government's conduct of this affair, as I understand it, for the last 10 days. Have you made up your mind tonight?
I've made up my mind. I needed reassurance. I'm delighted with the result, of course, and I'm relieved as well. It's very difficult when you are a Tory activist on the streets. It's very difficult trying to spread the good news message, the economic good news, to people that I represent, when there are questions of honesty and accountability hanging over the government.
But why are you reassured? How are you reassured?
I'm reassured because I felt this afternoon that at last perhaps the arrogance had been dropped. There was an acknowledgement that mistakes had been made, and there were measures to be put into place.
Andrew Marshall, you're Conservative candidate for Birmingham Edgbaston. Now, do you accept Donald Dewar's charge? You heard him there a bit earlier in the programme say this is a shaming day for government.
Well, Edgbaston is a highly articulate constituency, and I can tell you that in the last week we've had one phone call and no letters on Scott. So the fact of the matter is it's not a major issue on the doorstep. The voters are keeping it in perspective. I think they'll welcome the humility the government has shown today in admitting mistakes, accepting the central recommendations, and the fact of the matter is we can now get on talking about the issues that voters really care about.
Eileen Salloway from Devon County Council, you resigned from the Conservative Party as a result of the Scott affair, I understand.
Yes,
now, why did you do that?
I've been dismayed by the way the government have handled it. I feel that it has been above party politics. It's a matter of the integrity of our Parliament.
And what about today's debate? Did that not do anything for you? They won the debate.
No, I think it's a hollow victory, and I think the row will continue now, and I think in some ways it's a great pity that the vote was won.
John Proctor is a Leeds City Councillor, What do you think of people like the ones we heard in Fiona Bruce's report there, who are effectively saying, if we, people like Robert Davis, the managing director there, and Tom Turvey, the person who resigned from Police Authority, if we can resign because we feel we have to take the rap, why can't government ministers?
I think you've seen in the debate today a clear undertaking that things shall be reformed. But it's clear after 3 years plus, that there was no conspiracy whatsoever. There was no deliberate misleading of Parliament. The government has won tonight. I'm very pleased that they've won indeed. And I think there are there are far fewer people out there in the country as a whole who value Scott as a real issue than do members within Parliament and in TV studios, quite frankly.
Tony Dalton, as former leader of Warwick District Council, how impressed have you been by the government's conduct of this whole affair?
Well, I think we've got a problem. I think the Conservative Party is a tarnished party because of the Scott affair, and I hope that this has now cleared it by having won this vote, and what Ian Lang said today. But it's important that the party now picks up and moves forward. I happen to be one of the few people who still thinks resignations would have been a good idea.
What do you mean by tarnish? What damage do you think it's going to do to the party in the country?
I think
Do people really care that much about Scott?
I don't think it's so much Scott, but it's the attitude. It's going right through. It's the Nolan. It's all the different things that have happened. They're building up.
Andrew Marshall.
That's the concern.
Well, I can tell you that in the West Midlands, major manufacturing region, there will be some voters who will be saying, well, if the government is being criticised because the government has been too concerned about manufacturing jobs and manufacturing exports, they will be giving the government the benefit of the doubt.
Final word, Eileen Salloway, is there anything you think government can do to restore itself?
Not on the Scott issue. I think I would have liked to have seen them apologise, and I would have liked to have seen somebody stand up and take responsibility for what's happened.
Thank you all very much. Back to you, Kirsty.
And just to repeat, the government won by just one vote tonight, defeating Labour's procedural motion on the Scott debate, 320 to 319. Two Conservative MPs voted with the opposition, Richard Shepherd and Quentin Davis, and two more abstained or were unable to vote. In a surprise move, all 9 Ulster Unionists voted against the government, which explains the narrowness of the majority. The Prime Minister has given his first reaction to the vote. He said, "I have consistently acted upon open the public sector up to scrutiny since I became Prime Minister. I intend to continue to do so." Ian Lang, before we go on to talk about accountability, let's quickly break the row over the Ulster Unionists meeting John Major tonight and indeed Northern Ireland ministers. It's clear then that John Major was not prepared to do the deal that they wanted.
Well, I don't know the details of this row. I wasn't involved in the meeting, but I draw two conclusions from it. Firstly, that the Prime Minister was not prepared to enter into that kind of negotiation, that he stood firm on principle on matters affecting Northern Ireland, even though there was this difficult position in the House of Commons. And secondly, that the Ulster Unionists, who seem to have voted on their own internal reasons rather than on the merits of the Scott issue, by adding all their support to the Labour Party, have failed to defeat the government. And so I think we can draw two good conclusions from that outcome.
Well, turning to Ming Campbell and Donald Dewar, what Ian Lang was saying earlier is true, isn't it? That Scott hedged his bets in many ways, didn't he? The language was almost obfuscatory language, double negatives and so forth, that you could read some of it two different ways.
I think if you looked at the opinion, it got no prizes for plain English.
No.
But if you looked at the findings in fact, they are a pretty damning indictment. And if you were a jury looking at the facts as turned up in the evidence, you'd have no doubt at all that the government was guilty of deliberately misleading Parliament and of considerable errors of judgment. I mean, I thought it extraordinary to listen to Rupert Allison. I mean, the very concession that he imagines he has got, if he's right, is a condemnation of the government, because they maintained throughout this that in fact the very opposite was desirable and defensible. I think it's been a caning for the government, a damaging business, and it'll haunt them, and rightly, for a very long time.
Do you think there'll be any real changes, Mingus Campbell?
No, and indeed all of the things that Ian Lang put forward this afternoon, if they had been in place in 1988 or 1989, wouldn't have made the slightest difference, because what was then abroad was a determination to be flexible or liberal, whatever you like to choose, and not to tell Parliament about it. And if all of these procedures had been in place, precisely the same result could easily have occurred. That is the damaging feature of all this, and indeed it's very damaging for the credibility of people like Mr. Allison. When he looks at Hansard tomorrow, I think he'll find that the cast iron guarantees and undertakings he got aren't worth very much.
Ian Lang, when you hear those activists talking to Peter Snow, they're not people that are happy with this government and the way this government conducts its business. They don't believe it's an open government, they believe this government is tarnished.
Well, you've got a rather mixed reaction from those activists to whom you talk. Some of them were supportive, some of them were confused, some of them said it wasn't an issue of any great interest, others were critical. I can understand the confusion, because for the last 3 years this issue has been represented to the public by the Labour Party as being an issue about the Conservative Party plotting to arm Saddam Saddam Hussein in secret, to keep the matter from Parliament, and plotting to obscure the evidence and prevent the courts from carrying out a fair trial. Those were the allegations that caused this inquiry to be set up in the first place. What they're doing now is moving the goalposts, moving to a number of procedural points, a number of detailed points on the administration of foreign policy, and trying to create great issues where, in truth, the underlying facts do not support the kind of burden they're placing.
Very briefly, no humility, no contrition, no apology?
On the contrary, the things that Scott has brought out, which are useful and of which action will be taken, are on things like PII certificates, where it is quite clear that although it is judge-made, there is scope for government to become involved and to consult more widely and possibly allow changes to develop. Also on export controls and licensing, and on intelligence handling. Those are three out of a number of areas where we are committed and will follow through the kind of changes that I would like to see.
Well, the vote may be over, but the debate certainly continues. Thank you, gentlemen, all very much. And back to you, Peter.